Thank you for joining the Judaism Demystified podcast. First of all, we'd like to promote your book. This is Kohelet by David Curwin, as you can see. If you could tell us a little bit about yourself, how you were influenced by Rabbi David Fohrman, and why you chose to write a book about Kohelet, that would be amazing.
Well, first of all, thank you both for having me on the podcast. I'm I would say like a long time listener, first time caller stuff on the radio. So I feel like the same thing after listening to you guys for quite a while. And I do like your approach, the demystifying. I think it's a very interesting and very necessary approach to kind of pull away some of the layers. You can see things a little more in the way they actually are meant to be. And hopefully that will come clear in some of the discussion of my approach to Kohelet, where sometimes it might appear as being actually I'm adding unnecessary layers, but I think I'm actually, kind of pulling them away in a sense. So just for the record, I'm not in, I'm not a rabbi, I'm not a professor, I'm not a teacher. I have taught in the past many years ago, but I'm a real lover of learning Torah and studying different methods of approaching questions, especially in different issues about Tanakh, language issues especially. And I studied in Yeshivat Kibbutz Harati, which is unfortunately no longer open, but it was a very unique special institution that closed about 15 years ago. And they had teachers from many different backgrounds who would teach Torah, Torah, Halacha, Tanakh, Talmud, everything in a lot of different methodologies. And it opened me to the idea that there's not just necessarily one way to learn about something. And even they would even have sometimes debates or panels where one person would say one thing, another. It encouraged debate, encouraged critical thinking, and I really got a lot out of my time there. And even when I left the yeshiva and ended up entering, regular working life, but still had an interest in Torah, so I was inspired by teachers who would be able to use these kinds of interesting and advanced methodologies. And about 10 years ago, I was exposed to the teaching of Rabbi David Fohrman. As you mentioned, he had just started Aleph Beta. I actually heard him a little bit before. He had done some of the books came out before Aleph Beta. Some of the shiurim were online. I listened to them and I found it really interesting. Later became actually kind of close with it. He would visit Israel. I met with him a few times, participated in some internal forums to discuss some ideas. We'd have people to bounce off ideas. And so that was a really unique opportunity to be there when some of his ideas were not fully formed, just kind of experiments. But I continued on my way. I would occasionally give shiurim in shul or in different places, but it wasn't. I never had any anticipation of writing a book. I published a couple of articles in Tradition and other places, but never a book was sort of not something I thought about. And then it'll be 6 years ago this Sukkot, I came home from reading Kohelet, and once again for the nth time, I felt like I got nothing out of this book. What is this book for? The other Megillot are compelling and captivating, whether it's the historical events of Ruth and Esther or the emotional stories of Shir Hashirim and Echa, but like Kohelet, there was actually 1 year, many years ago, I actually broke my glasses because I fell asleep in Kohelet and hit my head in the stender and I broke my glasses. So I said this year it can't be this. And the truth is I wasn't even home. At home I have a rather large library. I have all kinds of things to look at. I have a brother-in-law who he's a rabbi, but he's not really in the Tanakh area. He didn't even have a concordancia. So all I had was I had the Megillah. That's all I had to look at. And I said I'm going to sit here and I'm just to see what I can find. And it was like little by little things started popping off the page to me. I started noticing all these connections to the opening chapters of Sefer Bereshit, the first 4 chapters of the story of Adam HaRishon being in the garden, the story of them sinning and being expelled from the garden, the stories of Cain and Hevel, and I was like, why is this here? Like it wasn't like I was looking for something. I was just like, this is very strange. Some verses were nearly lifted out of there, like one for one copied. There were other words that were repeating. There were thematic connections, talking about rivers and talking about snakes and talking about all kinds of things. And I was like, this has to be something to it. But I didn't really know where it was going to go. So I continued looking, found more and more connections, came home, started made notes about what these things were. I originally thought, maybe this will be a Dvar Torah I'll give some night. And then I thought, well, all right, fine. Maybe it'll be a shir. Okay, it's a little bit bigger. Okay, an article. And then all of a sudden I was like, I got a lot of stuff here. Maybe this actually would be a book. So together with some people in my community in Efrat and and particularly with Rabbi Fohrman and his team, I was able to try to, flesh it out to sort of talk about what, where does this go? What does this mean? As expanded even sometimes beyond the scope of Kohelet, it was becoming more and more. And that was really where I basically was based on the idea of Rabbi Fohrman's idea of intertextuality. That was what I really discovered. That the idea of intertextuality is where one text by similar words, phrases, themes, structures can shed light on another. Sometimes both will shed light on another, and sometimes one will shed light on the other. A famous example of this is certainly the story of Megillat Esther and the story of Yosef. That's a very famous one. A lot of people talk about this because if you read it, it's hard to miss. The stories of the language is similar. There's stories of a Jew or somebody from Israel in a foreign palace, and how do you deal with the challenges of Galut, and so. And when you read it, you say, oh, there's no way the person who wrote Megillat Esther wasn't trying to make you think of the story of Yosef. But why that it wasn't enough? So why was the story of why was the author of Kohelet trying to make me think of the story of Adam HaRishon, of the beginning chapter of Bereshit? And that was a challenge. At first I wasn't sure.
Question. When you said that Aleph Beta was involved, did you have a relationship with them at that time, or did you hand in the material, emailed Aleph Beta, and they how did that work? I'm just wondering if you had a relationship with Aleph Beta at that time.
I did. I had a relationship just as a student of Rabbi Fohrman, nothing official. I would come to his shiurim. I had participated in some of his
events. You presented the ideas, and then they helped you with it.
Yeah, it wasn't even originally a manuscript. It was originally just we had a video session where there was a bunch of people who had shared ideas. He has a number of these forums where he can bounce off his ideas, other people can share theirs.
Oh, okay.
Very cool. And I think I might have been actually one of the first ones to share my own ideas. Who wasn't an employee of Aleph Beta, but it was an opportunity because it just seemed so fitting for Rabbi Fohrman, because the intertextuality stuff that's Rabbi Fohrman's bread and butter. And so it was really I knew that he would be the person to ask about something like this.
Really cool. Sorry to interrupt you, by the way. I apologize.
No, please. I want to say something at the outset. I wasn't, I didn't mention it before. You have I mentioned Kohelet, and I think it's important to mention, to discuss at least briefly the question of authorship. Some people find that very compelling. They find that the focus of everything. They always want to talk about any biblical book. They want to talk about authorship. Others find it less of interest. I actually just heard your very interesting interview with Dr. Erica Brown. I found that a very interesting comparison between the way we each approach Kohelet. Why there not only is Professor Erica Brown, but Dr. Yoni Grossman also just came with a book on Kohelet, also by Curwin. Why this all happened at the same time, I don't know. I mean, this is not a new project for me, but I guess maybe this is one of the books that's last likely to be tackled, and so everyone's sort of looking at it now. Anyway, Dr. Erica wasn't so interested in authorship. I'm not hyper focused on it. I would say there's a difference between authorship and author's intent. I think it's a really, really important thing. And this goes, I think, up to your question about demystifying things. In other words, I'm not going to say that the author, that the Kohelet, if you just take that Kohelet, it was written by, the nature of what we say was written by, let's say, by Shelomo HaMelekh. I, in addition to my writing of the book, I have a blog where I discuss, called Balashon, where I discuss the origins of Hebrew words and phrases, the history of Hebrew words. I'm very, very much aware of the significance of language, and I can't ignore that there are many words and structures in the book of Kohelet which point to late authorship. They borrow from Aramaic, they borrow from Persian. There's things there that just don't fit an early description. But I'm not really focused on the who actually necessarily compiled it. And there's opinions in Chazal which talk about that. Kohelet was written by Shlomo HaMelekh, but it was maybe Chizkiyahu wrote it. There's even a place in Avot Rabbi Natan which talks about how Anshe HaKnesset were involved in authoring it, which certainly that's a late period. That in and of itself doesn't bother me. It doesn't I famously use the approach, let's say, of Rabbi Soloveitchik in the opening to Lonely Man of Faith, where he just says those issues don't don't bother his faith. What I can say in terms of, not about authorship, but in terms of author intent, that when you read Kohelet, I have no doubt that you are supposed to think about Shelomo HaMelekh. It doesn't mention Shlomo, but there is no one else who fits the king described in the book like Shlomo HaMelekh. And there's some very basic evidence of that. For example, who was the king in Yerushalayim, the son of David? So there wasn't the only king in Yerushalayim, son of David, was Shlomo. But who built that many things? Who had so many wives? Who had these huge projects? Who had who had such wisdom? If you're talking about the way that the book is described, it's Shlomo, and I think that's what I want you to read it as. So when I started these, go on.
Very well said.
So when I started to think about the comparisons between Kohelet and Bereshit, I'm thinking about the comparisons between Shlomo HaMelekh and Adam HaRishon. And that was something I never really considered before I started looking at the book. But then they also came kind of, jumped out at me, these comparisons. Both were universal figures. Adam HaRishon was certainly universal in the sense that he was the only man at the time. And Shlomo was probably the most universal of all at least the Jewish biblical figures. Maybe, not a fair Koresh, but certainly of the Jewish biblical figures, there's no one else who had that scope of Shelomo HaMelekh, in terms of, everyone coming in from all over the world and building a Beit HaMikdash that everyone would come to. This is something that's universal. But they also both had their downfalls. And the downfalls was as tragic, the trajectory of down was as sad as the trajectory up for the potential that they had. And in a sense, both of their downfalls were connected to a search for knowledge. Adam HaRishon was literally reaching for the tree of knowledge, taking something from the tree of knowledge that he wasn't supposed to take. And Shlomo HaMelech's story is more complicated. I get it a little more into the book, but we view him as a very wise king, but it's not so simple. And even Chazal are very critical about how he uses wisdom. They criticize his story about the judgment with the two women and the baby. They talk about what he did with how he connected to various people and what he told and said. They even go so far to say that he wasn't necessarily worthy of Olam Haba, which is kind of crazy when you think about it. But I figured there's nothing I could say about Shlomo that would go that far. So I felt a little bit free reign to be a little bit critical, but just from looking at the story. And then both Adam and Shlomo were exiled from their homes and from their place of God in a sense. And so when I looked at Kohelet, which is very critical, by the way, of the search for knowledge, it basically says it's pointless. There's no all the search for knowledge. You think you're getting somewhere, you're not going to get anything from it. So Shlomo was saying, what was the point of it? But who could he identify with? He had to go back and say, I'm going to write a book in the style of someone who could identify with my life. He probably couldn't think of anyone better than Adam HaRishon. And so I think that the book of Kohelet is written in a way as if Shlomo is echoing or channeling or whatever verb you prefer to use, the life of Adam HaRishon. And that's something that makes the linguistic connections in the book so compelling. If it was just a coincidence, you might just say, okay, well, I don't know what's going on, but their lives have a lot of parallels. So that's something that kind of came out to me as well.
So I'd like to hear, if you can, some of the examples of the narrative, how they connect. You could say it outside, don't have to
Right.
pull it up, but also the name Hevel means vanity and futility. I mean, it's been translated in many different ways. We heard Erica Brown's, which I find to be more compelling. Why would Adam give his son such a name? So that's another point that you brought up in the book.
Sure, I'm happy to talk about that. When it comes to first, I want to talk a little bit just about the structure of the book. I know that a lot of people find the book very, very confusing, and even tedious because it just seems to go from topic to topic. I didn't speak to Erica directly, but I did see Professor Yoni Grossman at the Yemei the Tanakh conference a few weeks ago, and I was very glad they had a few minutes to talk to him. And I said I pitied him. I felt bad for him because he had to write a book about Kohelet in order, the same way that Dr. Brown did. They had to write it in order of chapters, and it's very difficult to write in that way, and to write a book about Kohelet that way, because it doesn't seem to have it. I mean, you can put a structure in it, but it doesn't seem to have a structure. Repeat itself, they go back and forth. So one of the things I wanted to understand was why was it written in such a strange way? And this goes to, I think, goes to answer your question about Hevel. When Adam sinned, he and Chava received a number of punishments. But I think the most serious of the punishments would probably be the introduction of death into the world. There's different ways to interpret whether man was going to die or not, but certainly, there was death is associated with the eating of the fruit. So death is introduced. But who was the first person to die? It's not Adam. It's not Chava. It's Hevel. Hevel dies. How would Adam have felt feeling the responsibility of the death of his son? You can imagine Pastor going to like a shiva, someone who not only lost a child, but let's say they lost a child because of something that happened that they were guilty of, drunk driving, an accident, something where they would be inconsolable. They wouldn't be speaking, when you go to a shiva of someone who's, lived to 90, then they tell you their stories about where they were when they're young and when they get older, and the story, it's sequential, it makes sense. You go to a shiva of someone who lost a child, and certainly someone who's feeling guilty for what happened, it's going to be all over the place. And that's what I think is going on in Kohelet. And that's why I think that he repeats the name Hevel, Hevel, Hevel over and over again as sort of this plaintive cry of mourning for his lost son. That's what Shelomo would imagine that Adam HaRishon would have done. Now you asked an interesting question, which I had to address about why would anyone choose the name Hevel? As you said, it can mean futility, it can mean vanity, it can mean pointlessness. But as Dr. Erkman pointed out, and I agree, the basic meaning of Hevel in the Tanakh is breath. Hevel piv is literally someone's breath. So why would someone name their son Breath? That's kind of a strange name. And certainly it's not a positive association, the name Hevel. It has it's certainly generally associated with things like futility and vanity, even if it doesn't literally always, something that just literally means breath. So there's a approach to names in the Tanakh, which I think is really important. How does the name reflect what the parent thought when they were born versus reflecting what happened to them later in life? And sometimes it could be a literary device. And I think that's not so crazy. There are times, maybe someone, we see a lot of times in the Tanakh that people had one name when they were born with, and they got another name. So maybe they got a name to reflect, they were called something later on. That's certainly possible. There's examples in the Tanakh where that very likely happened. David, for example, my name. People say actually it wasn't, he might have had a different name in the beginning and then his name was changed. That's fine, but this is a different story. I think a good parallel example is the names of Elimelech's sons in the book of Ruth, Machlon and Kilion, which are also very negative names. And some people can find a positive spin on them. Maybe it doesn't mean disease and destruction. Maybe it means, Machlon could be like from Machol, from dance, something happy. But the idea is that you could have a positive name that ended up having negative associations later on. That's what I think happened with Hevel. I think, again, this is my own sort of midrash, but I don't think it's so far away from the plot, and certainly it's something that spoke to me from the text, and I think that's what basically we're inspired to do when we read the Tanakh for the first time with new eyes. That's something we could do. So there's an interesting midrash, which I think is actually fairly close to the pshat, or at least it's not far from it. It points out that when referring to the birth of Cain, it says that Chava was pregnant and then gave birth. But with Hevel, the second child, it only says she gave birth. So the Chazal say that this might have been twins. And again, we've seen tension between twins before, or later in the Tanakh, so it's not crazy to think that Cain and Hevel could have been twins. Even if not, I think this idea still works, but it's just a little stronger image if they're twins. What you have here is these. You can imagine a scenario where a difficult birth. Certainly in biblical times, births were not easy. We see it with Yitzchak and with Yaakov and Esau. You see it with Tamar's children. It was difficult. So imagine it's a difficult pregnancy. The child is born. She's not sure if he's breathing, and then he breathes. It would be a praiseworthy thing to call him Hevel. This is something he actually has breath. Who would imagine this child they didn't know was going to survive has breath, and then he lives his life. He's the one representing breath. It's an amazing thing. It's something they appreciate. However, breath is fragile. Breath is temporary. And in the end, he passes away like a breath. In other words, his life was futility because he didn't survive. But that same futility, that same fragility was what represented his life at the beginning. So I think that can potentially be a way to explain why a parent would give his name to a child of something that wasn't so, so positive. Clearly, this is within a literary framework of, I don't think it's likely someone today would name their child Hevel because of breath and that not do. But certainly within the framework of Tanakh, I think it works both for the birth and for his later life as well.
Fascinating.
I wonder with Kohelet how kind of Dr. Brown alluded to this. I'm wondering if you would maybe put this together that Hevel also kind of changes meaning as Kohelet goes on. It starts off as negative, but then sort of becomes somewhat positive towards the end. I wonder if there's
I didn't sense a change in the meaning of Hevel in the book. And the truth is, I really didn't see a lot of differences in the book from beginning to end. In terms of Dr. Brown's theory about this, I think her name of the book is The Search for Meaning,
yes,
which she finds in the book. If I had to give a parallel subtitle, I would have called it The Search for Knowledge, because the search for meaning is arrived at. Knowledge is a very different thing, and there's a lot more danger in the search for knowledge, as the book of Kohelet describes.
I see what you're saying.
One of the things I would say, though, is that about the end of the book, at least, there are people who sometimes view that the very end of the book, about the whole point of man is to keep the mitzvot and fear God. That's like tacked on. It's not relevant. Some people even view it as a separate author. I don't think that's true. I don't think it makes sense. I think it's the message of the entire book. You have someone. I think you have to, first of all, when you're looking at Kohelet, you have to remember that, or I think you understand, it's written very cynically at times. So sometimes people will say, "Oh, here he says eating and drinking and having festivity is a good thing," and other times he says it's a bad thing, or here a woman is a good thing and something's a bad thing, and they say, Chazal say it was contradictory, maybe shouldn't be included in Tanakh. Other people say it's reflecting different voices. There's books about how it's Kohelet's different voices. I don't see it at all. I just see like he's someone saying, yeah, almost like winking at you or saying, "Oh, yeah, wonderful life if you have eating and drinking as much as you want. Look where it gets you in the end." He's being a little cynical, a little sarcastic, which is reasonable. And so I think the tone is fairly consistent. But the main message of it is that what did Kohelet think? All he had to do, if it's Shlomo, all he had to do was follow God's wishes. God gave him everything, and he blew it. Certainly, Adam HaRishon did the same thing. Literally one mitzvah. You had one chance, one mitzvah, and he threw it away. If Shlomo's trying to understand what better verse, that kol ha'adam, what better verse could represent Adam HaRishon's life than the very end, which is saying, if you just follow God's mitzvah. Now, this is not about just following the Shulchan Aruch. It means, what is it? It's not saying halacha disconnected from our humanity. Both Shlomo and Adam HaRishon had a very unique connection with God. They had a special relationship that almost no one else in the world would know. Shlomo, God walked with Adam HaRishon in the garden. Shlomo had built the Beit HaMikdash and had a very special connection with him. And they lost that intimacy. They didn't have to go that path. Adam didn't have to eat the fruit. Shlomo didn't have to go with all these foreign entanglements with the wives and the political connections, and he didn't have to oppress the people. He could have just all they wanted was that connection. So the mitzvah is representing the love they had, not about some external requirement to keep this mitzvah or another. It's about losing the connection. I'm sure people who've had a marriage and something happened with that marriage, and they look back at their life and they got divorced, and they say because some infidelity or whatever, anything, and they're like, what did I do? I had everything. How did this happen to me? That's what Kohelet is. Kohelet is looking back and say, I had everything. How did this happen?
Amazing. Okay. So you pointed out that there are also thematic similarities between Kohelet and the story of the Spies. Can you elaborate on this?
Sure. So I wrote this whole thing about Kohelet and Bereshit, and I thought, okay, well, here we go. And I thought that was, I could wrap it up with a bow. It would work pretty well. And then I noticed something which I couldn't ignore. It's probably my linguistic side of me said, you can't just let this one go. There's a verb that appears in Kohelet a few times, and in very few other places in the Tanakh. And that verb is a loaded verb. It means something which you can't ignore it. It's the verb tor, taf vav resh, latur. And I have a special connection to Parshat Shlach. I've had, for some reason in my life, I have to give like a million Divrei Torah on Shlach. It was always the one that came up for some reason or another. And Torah is a key word in Parshat Shlach. It both describes what the spies had to do, and also what we are admonished against doing in the closing of this Parsha Shlach with Tzitzit, Lo tatu racharei lo v'chem racharei nechem. In Parsha Shlach, certainly the Torah chooses to use Torah intentionally. In Sefer Dvarim, it uses leragel, to spy. That's literally a spy. The Torah isn't really to spy; it's more to scout. It's actually that search for knowledge that's mentioned in Kohelet. And so, lo tatu racharei lo v'chem, it's not about. It wouldn't make sense. Don't spy after your heart, but to search for things you're not supposed to be searching for. That's Kohelet. That's Adam HaRishon. What are you doing going over that tree? What are you looking for? Why are you heading over there? And so I was like, okay, well, what's happening here? Why is the spy somehow connected to this? And little by little, I found a number of connections. I'm just going to look at them for a second because I always remember them immediately. But there's about 6-7 connections between the stories. So they both, if I compare the stories of Adam HaRishon and the spies, they both have a quest of knowledge for good and bad. Adam was looking for the tree of knowledge of good and bad, and the spies were told to search about good and bad in the land. They both acquire fruit. Hevel took the fruit, and they're supposed to take the fruit from the land. They both ignore God's command. They're told to do something, and they do something else. Their punishments were similar. Both of them were initially threatened with punishment of death, and the punishment they received but it was delayed. Adam didn't die right away. Hevel didn't die right from eating the apple, but they did die eventually. And the door of the generation of the spies, God wanted to kill them, and Moshe got them to put it off to kill him, but they still did die. They just didn't die 40 years or 38 years before they actually had died. So that's similar. They were both expelled from or prevented from entering God's land, but not just prevented from entering God's land. They both had a sword, the sword of the Kruvim and the sword of the Amalekites and the Tanim. They were the ones who prevented them from entering the land. And all those connections just said, okay, there's definitely something happening here. These are very similar stories. And when I started comparing it to the story of Shelomo, I realized that there were stories there as well, connecting also search for knowledge, betrayal, and taking things that didn't really belong to you. So I was able to make in the book. I make some tables where you compare these different themes. What I think is interesting, though, is that there's one last thing at the end of the story of the spies and the story of Adam HaRishon, which is a similar parallel. They both end with stories of clothing given to them by God. In the story of Adam HaRishon, it's literally God gives them clothing, and in the story of after the story of the spies, God gives them the mitzvah of tzitzit, the mitzvah of wearing the clothing. In the book, I discuss a lot about how this idea of clothing helps is a path to maybe rectify some of these sins. And there's a lot of discussion of clothing in the book, in various places, as well as with Shelomo as well. He also has a torn coat later on. There's a lot of things happening, and this is another connection between all these stories.
Beautiful. So I want to switch gears to another topic, which is the Ashkenazi communities read Kohelet on the holiday of Sukkot. And there are many reasons given for why this is the custom. But why do you feel the themes in Kohelet align with this holiday?
Okay, it's a good question. First of all, I want to be clear. I don't the historical reasons why Kohelet was chosen. I don't know if I can't say with any certainty that these are the reasons why they're chosen. All I can say is, if you ask me what book should be read in Sukkot, I would pick Kohelet. It speaks to me. It seems so like it's a perfect fit. Maybe there was a reason. Maybe it was just the last Megillah to find a place. You had to find a place to read Kohelet, and because Esther is going to be obviously read in Purim, and Shir Hashem is for the spring, and Eicha, but either way. So I think that we just actually read this past week, right? Last week, this week. You have. Well, I'll actually jump a little bit at the end. One of the most important things about Shlomo's life, and this is something Chazal go over and over again, is that he ignored the laws of the kings. Right? Because kings are not supposed to amass have a lot of wives, amass gold, horses. And Shlomo famously, according to Gemara and Sanhedrin, but I think also this is fairly the shot of what happened with him. He basically, explicitly ignored these rules. He decided on his own that he would be able to handle the consequences of those laws, and to his, man, it worked out terribly. What's interesting though is if you look at those laws of what you're not supposed to do and why you're not supposed to, the king is not supposed to like larum levavo, his heart shouldn't be lifted above his brethren, and so on. There are linguistic parallels, very strong linguistic parallels to what we just read this Shabbat Parshat Ekev. I'm not sure when this is going to be released, but that we just read Parshat Ekev, and it's a very, very similar passage. And the people of Am Yisrael are pretty much warned to not. They're not mentioned about amassing wives and tremendous amounts of gold, but they're warned about the risks of affluence, which I know you guys have talked about also. That the risk of affluence to a nation that's about to enter the land is very serious, and it talks about how you're gonna have herds and flocks, and they're multiplied. Your silver and gold is going to increase, which is very similar to the what the king has to deal with. Your heart will grow haughty, ram levavcha, which is very similar parallels to the king, and the risk is you're going to forget God, which is pretty much what happens to Shlomo later on, right? It's almost a similar thing, but so the idea is that we have a scenario where the king has warnings, but those same warnings ultimately apply to us individual members of Am Yisrael as well. What's interesting though is that one more warning that the people get, which the king do not get, is that you're going to build houses, right? The risk of building houses suddenly appears as a sign of prosperity, and the king is never warned against building a house in Sefer Devarim, but that's exactly what got Shlomo into trouble, right? As he built his own house, he built his house bigger than the house of the Beit HaMikdash, and the project of building the Beit HaMikdash was what ended up leading to the oppression of the people, which caused them to revolt. There's a lot of Chazal B'Dashim which talk about him. They say that the night that the Beit HaMikdash was conceived, was built, dedicated, that was when he had the ancestor of Nebuchadnezzar was born, and it was the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash was built into its construction in the first place. And so there's a real danger in building houses. You don't find people building houses in the Tanakh and in the Torah from Yaakov Avinu, in a very small esoteric passage we're looking into now, when he goes to a place called Sukkot, he builds a house. That's the first time you see someone building a house. And there's no verbs. I mean, there's verbs about talking what if you build a house, and there's houses and things, but there's no case of someone building a house from Sukkot until David and Shlomo. That's the next time you see a description of someone building a house. The Torah is not interested in houses. Houses are risky. You build a house. Who built the house? There's a famous thing. If the house is built and God built it, but it's easy enough to forget that God built that house. This came to me as a bit of a shock when I first read it. I mean, I read it before, but it never really it lands on me every time I think about now. Tisha B'Av not long ago, I think about this a lot. David wants to build a house for God. He wants to build a Beit HaMikdash. God says, whoa, don't. This isn't for me. This is for you. I was perfectly happy in an Olam Moed. I was happy in a Yiriyah. I was happy in a tent. The house, this is for you. And the consequences of building a house are on you. God later finds himself in the house. It's not a question that God is associated with the house, but we took that risk. It's extremely similar to the parallel of you don't need a king. God doesn't say we have to have a king. You have to have, you have the leadership, but the king is a risk. And the end, Shmuel is very angry that they accept the king. We end up having a king. We believe the king it's become entrenched in Judaism. Mashiach as a king, as a goal. Beit HaMikdash is something we wish for, but both of those things are not something that God wanted. That's something that we want. It's kind of like we have a parent who tells the kid, you want that toy, you want that thing. Okay, you have to understand the risk of having it. So, anyway, so I think the idea of Sukkot is when we take a breather. We have a harvest festival, the highest peak of abundance of affluence throughout the entire year. And instead of sitting and enjoying it like a normal person would do, to suddenly enjoy this thing, no. You're not just you're gonna leave your house, think about where you were in the Midbar. I know you guys are big Rambam fans. I'm also a really big Rambam fan. The Rambam Moreh Nevuchim has a very, very very sharp explanation for Sukkot, which most people don't quote because it's not the most fun thing to talk about on Sukkot, so most people don't hear it. But I don't know if you're familiar with what he says. He basically says that why do we sit in Sukkot? To remember the difficult times in the Midbar. He compares it to Maror. He says it like Maror. The reason we Maror is to remember how difficult was slavery. The reason we sit in Sukkot is to remember how difficult it was in the Midbar. When we didn't have houses, the positive aspect is the Arba Minim. That's about Eretz Yisrael. But the Sukkot is not a positive thing. It's a difficult thing. He says that's why God gave us Shmini Atzeret. So we have one chance to sit in houses like good people, that people can actually enjoy things. But we get 7 days of out being out of the house and only 1 day inside out, so we can actually enjoy ourselves.
How would the
That's
Rambam
Sukkot.
explain though? How would the Rambam explain like Simcha B'Et HaShoeva, all the Simcha associated with the Chag? How would that fit?
Because again, most of it's, I would say it's similar to Pesach. Pesach has a dual nature, where on the one hand we talk about how free we are. On the other hand, we're constantly remember how we were slaves, right? Where we sit in the we're Yoshvim Mesubin, but we also eat matzah and maror. We have there's a duality, because if you only had one side of it, you would not remember the other side. Pesach and Sukkot are not supposed to be Tisha B'Av. You're not supposed to do and be miserable the whole time. But if you just had a holiday, you would not. He talks about this. I think actually he talks about it in not in Moreh Nevuchim, but he talks about it in the Mishnah Torah about how it has to not be a simchat keres. Keres in modern Hebrew is like your gut. If someone's got a big gut, they have a keres. So in order to prevent Sukkot from being a holiday of the keres, of being a holiday of your gut, just eating, you have to have the other aspects. You have to have the aspect where you remember how difficult things were and how you got to where you are. You have to remember that it's not you're not the it's very easy to imagine a landowner who suddenly has all the fields, gets all the harvest, and suddenly feels great, to easily forget God. That's what we just read about. That's what we're warned against doing. We're warned against forgetting God in the abundance. So Sukkot gives us a chance to take a break, and I think it actually goes even further. I think that's the purpose of I think it's the purpose of Yom Kippur, to take that break. Tishrei is the month of the festival month. Why do we stop eating in the middle of, who's telling you to stop eating? The food's already finally all summer. You've been waiting, you're working really hard. The food's in front of you. No, you're going to stop eating. And even Rosh Hashanah, if we want to go a little bit step further, it's not, I don't mention the book, but Rosh Hashanah I think is also like that. Every month you're supposed to do, according to in the Midbar, it talks about every month you're supposed to do blow on the trumpets. But there's a difference between Trua and Tekiah. Every month you do Tekiah. Tekiah is a happy occasion. The only Rosh Chodesh that you're supposed to do Trua, Yom Trua, is the first of Tishrei, which would normally be people like, it's supposed to be, if a festive blowing is Tekiah, and the sign of war, the sign of trouble is Trua. Why would anyone think of all the months to blow Tekiah? You do a Tekiah Gadol on Tishrei. No. You're gonna do Trua, to slow down, guys. Take a break. You're not jumping into like Scrooge McDuck jumping into the gold coins. You have to take a break. You have to think about things for a minute. Don't rush into abundance. It's a real risk. It's a terrible risk. We see it with Adam HaRishon. Adam had everything. He had everything in front of him, every tree in the world, but he wasn't satisfied with that. He needed the one he couldn't eat. Shlomo had everything. He had God's house. He still needed the foreign gods and on the women. What is going on? And that's what Sukkot comes to teach us. It's a somber holiday with the possibility of hope, which I think is the message of Kohelet too. A somber book with the possibility of hope.
Yeah, and to your point, I think there's a anxiety of uncertainty when it comes to the harvest season, because you're really you're relying on Hashem, right? You don't know what's going to happen. You don't know if it's going to be a good season or a bad season. But then ultimately, on Sukkot we rejoice. So it's very similar to Kohelet in that way, where there's this anxiety and it kind of feels negative, and it sounds pretty bad. But then at the end, there's all these calls to action about rejoicing. So there's definitely that connection there. Very interesting.
Yeah, very thought-provoking. Can you also tell us any other takeaways you got from Kohelet, or that you came away with after writing your book?
So first of all, I would say that when I approach people about the book, I sometimes have to tell them, like, it's weird for me because it's not my personality to be kind of pushy about the book, and I sat to, but people were, I was at a book fair. Yerushalayim has the big Shavua Sefer, and I was trying to tell people who were like, Kohelet, I don't know about that. That's like, somebody said that's depressing, that's difficult, that's boring. And I was like, okay, I hear you. I thought the same thing. But I felt in a way that I told them in a way, I didn't feel that I wrote it. I felt that it was, revealed to me in a way, not like in a prophetic way, but just like I was peeling away the layers of something that was already there. There's, I kind of discovered it. I didn't create it. And I think that's something that we can all, appreciate in our Torah learning. Is it something that, there's things there that you might be the person who discovered an idea that never was. I mean, I know that people have mentioned connections to Bereshit before, but maybe I did it in a slightly more, comprehensive way. Maybe I caught some things that no one had connected the dots before between. But I think everyone out there who's, I think that's, for me, that's the beauty of Torah learning. I'm personally, that's that's what compels me. I'm not necessarily, I'll admit, I'm not really like a daf yomi, kind of person who wants to learn the same thing everyone else. I want to be learning that's what's interesting to me right now. And that's the thing. And so, but I think, usually when I talk to someone long enough, I'll find out that they had some interesting idea or even just a question. If you have the question, maybe you don't have the answer, but if the question, even the questions can be interesting. So I think that's something that's very rewarding in this thing. In terms of the book itself, I really do think it's the message is a message of hope and of tshuva, which is why I think it's also, Matim, it's good to be read around that time of year, around in Tishrei. We don't ever see what Adam HaRishon thought after the whole sin. We don't see what he thought about what happened with his sons Cain and Hevel. We don't. He's pretty much mute from after the right after the garden episode. We don't see that Shelomo did tshuva, which is kind of strange considering that Chazal say, and I think it fits that he wrote Shir Shirim in his youth and Mishlei when he's older and Kohelet in the end of his life. But we don't ever see a discussion of him. He's like, God calls him out in a very, very harsh way in Sefer Melachim, but we don't see anything. But if you view Kohelet as Shlomo's tshuva, as his, advice to us on how to avoid those errors, and specifically through some of those mitzvot that I talk about in the book, I talk about tzitzit as being a very essential idea of how tzitzit can be helpful. Because again, tzitzit are something that maybe you think of just some strings, but how could they help? But if you view tzitzit in a way in a kind of different way, this is the way that Ibn Ezra actually talks about, of being the frayed ends of a garment, not strings attached. The garment isn't complete. It's kind of like also like abundance. You're wearing a garment, it's not complete. It's kind of like pay on a field. You're going to remember that the field doesn't belong to you, it belongs to God. You got it from God. The garment also is like that. You remember the garment you received from God, like Adam HaRishon got a garment after his sin. I go into talking about the Yom Kippur service and how that also is kind of like a return to Gan Eden in a way. It's one time of year when the Kohen Gadol can really return to the state that Adam was like in the garden. And there's other mitzvot as well. So the laws of the king. In other words, these mitzvot that we have, and this I guess again speaks to your title. It's not. I don't believe in the mitzvot of having. Okay, I'll put it this way. I don't think tamei mitzvot is something that we need to be afraid of. I know that there are people who criticize the Rambam very harshly, and these are very great people. I actually wrote an essay about this published in Tradition a few years ago, where you have Rav Kook, Rav Hirsch, and Rav Soloveitchik all attacking the Rambam in language, which is for someone like the Rambam, you can't believe they're using this language against the Rambam. I mean, it's harsh. It's just harsh language. But I'm fine. I don't find a problem with the Rambam, bringing out these tamei mitzvot, because it helps us understand that God was giving these mitzvot to inspire us for a particular reason. And it doesn't. I don't find it that if the mitzvah doesn't have a reason, it makes it all that more special to me. When a dafka doesn't have a reason. There are people who find that. There are people who find those kinds of things who don't have a reason to be more special. For me, understanding what's going on. But looking at some of these mitzvot in their context and how they could help with these issues, I think that's where we go. Anyways, you can wear tzitzit and it's fine. But if tzitzit motivate you to understand your connection to God and your dependence on God, then how is that not going to possibly be a more enriched experience? I mean, you still show loyalty if you do mitzvot with understanding the reason. But by looking at the reasons for the mitzvot and understanding if it helps you bring the connection. I mean, it's the same with Sukkot. You can sit in a sukkah and just do because God said so, and it's fine. That's not a bad thing. But if you do it because it helps you understand the risk of abundance and all these things we were just talking about earlier, well, clearly that's going to make it a little more significant in terms of what the ultimate goal of what the Torah is taking it for. So I think that's Kohelet. I think Kohelet is it's basically Shlomo's drasha, to like say what's the, his ethical will, so to speak, about what's the point of how what works in life and what doesn't work in life. And that's something that's really special to be able to have. That actually, can give you hope if you can get over the difficult language and the repetition and the contradictions and everything else. But it's there. It's not hiding. It's really in plain sight if you read through the book.
I really share your feeling about the Tamei Mitzvot, and when you contextualize it also with history, and there's so many levels of unpacking the mitzvot that I can't see the harm in it. I don't see why it would be. It's amazing. To me, it's an amazing, inspiring thing to actually understand it and to compel us to improve ourselves as human beings. So before we go, I would like everybody to just see the book again. This is Kohelet, A Map of Eden. I highly, highly recommend this book to everybody. It's a very smooth reading. It's extremely insightful, and it's something that you can easily grasp, and at the same time, very deep. So I want to thank you so much for coming on the podcast. This was really very eye-opening, and we're really excited about seeing more work from you, hopefully, in the future.
Working on anything? Working on anything? Are you working on anything?
I am actually working on something which I think you guys would particularly be interested when I get this going. I'm working on a book that actually started before I was working on Kohelet, and Kohelet kind of fell into my lap, as I mentioned. It's a book about why Avram was chosen, but more specifically, why the Torah doesn't say why Avram was chosen or why Avram chose God. And I think that really lies at the heart of nearly every philosophical dispute in Judaism from the Tanakh until modern times. If you talk about the Rambam had a perception of Avram, Rabbi Levi had a perception of Avram. They were very different. And I think that I talk a lot about Tamei Mitzvot and the reasons behind what's the risk of Tamei Mitzvot. I do think you mentioned, there are risks because you talk about reasons, and what if those reasons are no longer true? That's the idea. You talk about the mitzvot coming from, if the korbanot, like the Rambam says, because of the, what happened in Egypt, well, if that's not risk anymore, should we abandon the mitzvot? I'm not denying there's risk, but I think that there's still a lot to be learned from them. So that's the book. It's about a third of the way through. I think the Kohelet season is probably going to slow down a little bit after Sukkot, and then hopefully I can get back into Avram. I would love to be able to speak to you guys. I hope that A, I can finish it in a short enough time, and B, I hope your podcast continues to succeed long enough that I finish the book while you're still doing this, because it's a big project, but I really hope to get to it.
Kohelet's getting a lot of love these days. Yeah. I mean, everyone is Kohelet's been
it's hot.
It's hot.
It is. It's strange. It's great. It's good for me. It works out well for me,
Awesome. Congratulations on the book. Very well said. A lot of thought-provoking ideas, a lot to think about, a lot to read about. Wishing you lots of success with the book and further. And we're gonna hopefully do that podcast down the line for sure.
I'm looking forward to it.
All right.
Awesome. Shavua Tov.
Shavua Tov.